Alexander gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to stay calm, even though his heart was pounding wildly in his chest. He was full of joyful anticipation. Leaving the office, the evening promised to be special. Today, he had the chance to spend the night at home. Lately, Alexander had been working night shifts as well since his company collaborated with foreign partners, leading to time zone discrepancies. Alexander didn't inform his wife about his early return. It was a perfect opportunity to surprise Charlotte. On the way, he bought a bouquet of her favorite lilies and a bottle of good wine. The drive home passed quickly. He imagined walking into the house, embracing his beloved wife, and enjoying a cozy evening together. Both Charlotte and Alexander earned well and were building a comfortable future for themselves. That's why every opportunity to spend time away from work was a real pleasure. When Alexander finally arrived at their countryside cottage, his joy suddenly dimmed. Charlotte's car was missing from the driveway. She must have gone to town on some errands, he thought at first. It made him uneasy, but he knew her job sometimes required late meetings with clients. Perhaps she was just running late. Entering the house, Alexander felt an unsettling sense of loneliness. He dialed her number and, holding his breath, waited for an answer. After a few moments, Charlotte picked up. Her voice was strangely distant and cold. "Hello. Charlotte, where are you?" "I got off work early," Alexander said happily. A long pause followed, making him tense up. "I'm not coming home tonight," Charlotte replied dryly. "What do you mean? Are you saying you won't be sleeping at home?" he asked, trying to stay composed. "Do I need to repeat myself? Didn't you understand the first time?" She snapped with an irritated tone Alexander had never heard before. He felt his heart clench. "Charlotte, what's going on? Why aren't you coming back?" "I have urgent work matters," she replied coldly. "Just don't bother me, okay? I'll be back tomorrow." Her tone was so rude and dismissive that Alexander barely contained his frustration. "Charlotte, why are you talking to me with such disrespect?" He felt his voice rise from disappointment and bitterness. "We'll talk about this when you get home." He tried to end the conversation, but all he heard was the dial tone. She had simply hung up. Clutching the phone in his hand, Alexander stood in the empty house, surrounded by silence, which with each passing minute felt more ominous. The next morning, Alexander sat at the kitchen table, gripping his hands tightly, staring at a cup of cold coffee. He hadn't slept all night, replaying his conversation with Charlotte over and over. Suddenly, through the window, he saw her familiar car pull up to the house. Charlotte stepped out calmly, carefully shut the door, and walked into the house as if nothing had happened. Noticing Alexander in the kitchen, she said briefly, "Morning." Without waiting for his reply, she announced that she was going to take a bath. Leaving the hallway, she headed straight to the bathroom, leaving him alone, simmering with anger. Alexander watched her go, unable to believe his eyes. She didn't even try to explain herself. Her calmness and indifference fueled his sense of betrayal and rage. Determined not to waste time, he grabbed his car keys and stepped outside. Alexander sat behind the wheel. Noticing the tablet on the dashboard, he instinctively turned it on and opened the navigation history. He found the address where Charlotte had spent the entire night. His eyes narrowed, and his fingers tightened around the wheel. Inside, a long-dormant emotion began to surface, a mix of pain and fury. Without hesitation, he opened the glove compartment and rummaged through the contents until he found a pack of condoms. The package had already been opened, and one was missing. That was enough. A wave of bitterness and pain washed over him, mixed with the realization of betrayal. He and Charlotte hadn't used any form of contraception for a long time. There was no need. And that fact only made his suspicions worse. 25 minutes later, Charlotte emerged from the bathroom, wrapped in a silk robe, smiling as she dried her hair with a towel. Her satisfied expression, as if nothing had happened, only fueled his anger. He waited silently for her to sit down across from him. When she finally met his gaze, a flicker of annoyance crossed her eyes, but only for a moment. "Don't you think you owe me an explanation? Where were you last night?" His voice was cold and tight like a drawn string. Charlotte rolled her eyes slightly and sighed with irritation. Alexander, I already told you it was work-related. There's nothing to discuss. But he was ready for her words. He threw the condom package onto the table between them. Is this work-related too? I checked your navigation history, he added with a bitter smirk. Whose place were you at all night? A tense silence filled the air, thick as fog. Finally, Charlotte sighed irritably and shot Alexander a dark look. What the hell were you doing snooping through my car and my things? She demanded. You're being ridiculous, Alexander. Alexander felt his anger flare up even more. I had to go through my wife's things because my wife is acting suspiciously, he shot back, feeling his voice crack with rage. Or, to be precise, because she's cheating on me and trying to make me look like an idiot. Charlotte immediately lifted her head, her eyes flashing with defiance. It wasn't cheating. Alexander nearly laughed at the absurdity of her words. So you spent the night at another man's house, and that's not cheating? He asked sarcastically, his heart pounding faster. What were you doing, watching cartoons? And the condoms, what? Were you filling them with water and throwing them off the balcony at passers-by? Charlotte jumped up, her face twisted with anger. She seemed to search for words, but finally blurted out. It wasn't cheating. It was gratitude. Gratitude? He repeated, barely able to suppress the sarcasm in his voice. Charlotte suddenly slumped into her chair, leaning back, avoiding his gaze. Her voice dropped to a near whisper. I ran into serious problems at work. I made a few mistakes, and I could have been fired. I put a lot of effort into this job. I wanted to get promoted, she sighed, continuing. It's a promising company, and they pay generously. We had plans, Alexander, and I wanted to keep my position there for us. And Logan stood up for me in front of the boss. Money? That didn't interest him, Charlotte continued, lowering her gaze. He just likes me. He tactfully hinted that he wanted gratitude. She paused for a moment, looked at him, and, narrowing her eyes slightly, added, I gave him what he wanted. It was just one night, and I got no pleasure from it. I love you, Alexander. Please, let's just forget about it. Alexander looked at her, feeling the blood pounding in his temples. Forget? She simply suggested forgetting what had happened, as if it could be erased in an instant, as if that night, her gratitude, was just a mistake or an accident. Charlotte glanced at the table and noticed the bouquet of flowers and the bottle of wine he had bought yesterday, hoping to spend a warm and cozy evening with her. She must have sensed his mood. Without saying another word, she opened the bottle, poured 2 glasses, and handed one to Alexander. Alexander, I really do love you, she said softly, trying to make her voice warmer. Yes, I did something wrong, but sometimes in life, you have to step beyond the limits to achieve greater success. She raised her glass as if proposing a toast to their relationship, hoping to erase all their problems. Alexander sat motionless, staring at her. He tried to catch even a glimpse of sincerity on her face, but her words already seemed empty and distant to him. Did he force you? Alexander asked, almost already knowing the answer. She didn't even look surprised by the question, as if she had been expecting it. No, Alexander. It was my decision, she replied. He only hinted that he would appreciate the favor. But understand, I needed his loyalty. Yes, it's not right, but the circumstances led to this. She sighed. Let's try to start fresh. Just forget it. I promise you, it will never happen again. Alexander nodded, feeling bitter exhaustion. Forget it? A mistake that won't be repeated? I understand you, Charlotte, he said, slowly, struggling to suppress the bitterness rising in his throat. Then, taking a sip of wine, he stood up and walked outside. The fresh air met him with a cooling gust. He took a deep breath, feeling his anger pulsing inside him. His thoughts were chaotic, but one thing was clear. He couldn't just let this situation go. Alexander had always prided himself on his self-respect and principles. The thought of being made a fool of drove him mad. His gaze turned cold and focused. He thought about divorce, but that idea seemed too simple, too easy. No, he needed to make sure Charlotte and her loyal friend Logan realized the price of their actions. He wanted them to feel the pain they had caused him, to understand that betrayal comes with consequences. After a few minutes, Alexander returned to the house, trying to appear calm and composed. He decided to play his role, to pretend to be a forgiving husband, to leave it all behind. "You know, Charlotte," he said, as if he had thought over her words, "I'll try to forget this, as if it never happened. It's not worth ruining our relationship over. Let's pretend it never happened." Her face immediately lit up, and she smiled at him gratefully. "Thank you, Alexander. I knew you'd understand," she said gently, adding, "You've always been smart and understanding." Alexander nodded, pretending to accept her words. Inside, a storm was still raging, but outwardly, he remained calm. She had no idea that her understanding husband was already planning a lesson she and Logan wouldn't forget. On Monday morning, as Alexander drove to work, a thought came to him, the very day Charlotte had confessed her gratitude to Logan. He remembered that her company had strict rules regarding romantic relationships between employees. It was considered a serious violation, and such infractions were dealt with swiftly and irreversibly by termination. Alexander knew that acting rashly would be risky without solid proof, and such an approach could backfire. Instead, he decided to take a more subtle approach and create a cover for himself. He met with his boss, Henry, and asked to be sent on a business trip. Henry was surprised by Alexander's request. Alexander was a valuable specialist, usually involved in major negotiations with foreign partners. And now, suddenly, "Alexander, you're not used to working in a factory," his boss said, raising an eyebrow. "Why the sudden urge?" Alexander smiled lightly and explained that he was tired of the intense schedule and wanted a slight change of scenery. "Well, if that's the case, a reset wouldn't hurt," Henry concluded, agreeing to arrange the business trip paperwork. Charlotte's reaction was calm and even slightly indifferent. She wished him luck, thanked him for telling her, and went about her business. Now, Alexander's absence wouldn't raise suspicion. But this was just the first step in his plan. The next day, Alexander searched online for small theater groups that organized various performances and staged public pranks. He met with the director of one such studio and shared his idea. He wanted young actors to play the role of casual witnesses who would be nearby when Charlotte was around. The group found the proposal amusing. It was a fun yet subtle setup, not too obvious but effective enough to create an impact. With everything planned and every detail carefully refined, Alexander felt a sense of satisfaction. Charlotte had no idea what awaited her in the coming days, but he could already picture her smile fading, replaced by panic and fear. Early the next morning, Alexander left for his business trip after saying goodbye to Charlotte. She carried on with her usual routine. Charlotte stopped by her favorite cafe near the office for coffee and a croissant. The aroma of fresh pastries filled the air, and the familiar atmosphere gave her a sense of comfort. After placing her order, she stood at the counter, waiting for the barista to prepare her coffee. Just as Charlotte reached for her cup, a young man in a business suit approached her. He gave her a curious look, as if recognizing her. Then, a subtle, almost imperceptible smile appeared on his lips. "Oh, it's you," he exclaimed with a hint of feigned enthusiasm. "I recognize you. You're the woman who rewards her colleagues at work, turning dull evenings into something truly exciting. How generous of you." Charlotte froze. His words hit her like a bolt of lightning. She stared at him, feeling her heart pound harder. "Excuse me," she muttered, completely thrown off balance. The man smirked. His serious expression suddenly shifted into something unsettlingly cheerful. "It's so noble of you, really. Not everyone is willing to help their coworkers like that," he added. Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked away, leaving Charlotte in complete confusion. She stood motionless for a few seconds, trying to process what had just happened. It felt like some kind of mistake or bizarre coincidence. Shaking herself out of her daze, Charlotte grabbed her coffee and croissant and hurried out of the cafe, convincing herself that it was just an unfortunate incident. The next day, despite her attempts to forget the previous encounter, Charlotte once again headed to the same cafe, trying to reassure herself that nothing significant had happened. "People say strange things sometimes. It doesn't mean anything," she told herself. But as soon as she reached the counter and placed her order, a man in a business suit
2.
His eyes widened when he saw her, and he broke into a broad smile. Madam, he exclaimed with respect and admiration. I've heard about your generosity. It's truly impressive, sharing yourself for the sake of career success. What an act of self-sacrifice. Charlotte turned pale. She stared at him in utter confusion, feeling a heavy emptiness settle in her stomach. What are you talking about? She stammered, barely holding back the tremor in her voice. The man merely waved dismissively. Don't be so modest. People like you gain fame quickly, selfless, and always ready to offer assistance. It's truly touching. He flashed her one last smile before walking away. Charlotte's hands trembled as she picked up her coffee. This couldn't be a coincidence. Panic seized her. People knew her secret. She tried to calm her growing anxiety, but her thoughts kept returning to that night with Logan. The night she thought no one would ever find out about. By midweek, her nerves were completely frayed. She kept telling herself that it was all just an absurd coincidence and that these strangers were simply making up wild stories. But the next morning, just as she placed her order, she was called out again. A young woman passing by stopped, smiled, and exclaimed, "Oh, you must be Charlotte. Everyone in your company is talking about how generous you are, especially with your male colleagues. Thank you for your kindness." Charlotte felt her breath hitch. Grabbing her coffee, she rushed out of the cafe, her mind in total chaos. This was no longer a coincidence. 3 times now, someone had spilled her secret, and the word was spreading. Unable to withstand the tension any longer, Charlotte hesitated for a moment before dialing Alexander's number. The phone rang endlessly, making her even more nervous, until finally, he answered. "Yes, I'm listening." His voice sounded slightly tense, immediately unsettling Charlotte. "Alexander," she began uncertainly. I don't know how to explain this, but something strange is happening to me. People are saying things about me, things they shouldn't know." There was silence on the other end, then Alexander seemed to collect himself. "Wait, Charlotte, I don't understand what you're getting at." His voice carried irritation, as if her suspicions were an insult to him. Charlotte hesitated, unsure of what to say. I just wanted to ask, have you told anyone about our conflict over that night? Because I don't understand how else to explain what's happening. Someone must have spread this information." His tone grew even sharper. "Didn't we agree to forget about it and leave it in the past? You were the one who said that. Why are you bringing this up now and stressing me out? Maybe you're just imagining things." Charlotte felt even worse at his words, as if she was somehow at fault for her past turning into a nightmare. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the suspicion that he knew more than he was letting on. She faltered, unsure how to explain her state of mind. He abruptly cut her off. "You know what, Charlotte? I'm at work on the production floor. By the way, I'm busy. Don't waste my time." The next moment, he turned on video call mode, showing his face with a bustling factory floor in the background, machines humming and workers moving back and forth.
"See?
I'm here, and you're distracting me with nonsense, reminding me of what you did." He emphasized the last words. Charlotte's heart clenched with shame. She sighed and mumbled, "I'm sorry, Alexander. I guess I'm just too nervous." "Then calm yourself down," he snapped before abruptly ending the call, leaving her in complete confusion. After talking to Alexander, Charlotte's suspicions turned to Logan. Maybe he had told someone about that night. What if he had spilled their little secret behind her back? Charlotte couldn't shake her anxious thoughts and decided to confront Logan directly. Waiting until the office was quieter, she quietly entered Logan's office, making sure no one saw her. Closing the door behind her, she approached his desk and leaned in. "Logan, did you tell anyone about us?" Her voice was filled with panic. "About what we did? Are you crazy?" he hissed, quickly glancing at the door as if afraid someone might overhear. "Why the hell would you ask me that? I haven't told anyone. If someone finds out, we'll both get fired." Charlotte felt a mix of relief and frustration. She didn't take her eyes off him, still wary. "Something's wrong," she whispered, almost as if trying to convince herself she wasn't imagining things. Get out of my office before someone suspects anything. And for God's sake, take something for your nerves. You're not yourself. You're being paranoid. Charlotte stood there, feeling utterly lost. His reaction only confused her more. Returning to her desk, she caught herself wondering if she was actually going crazy. Maybe she just needed to calm down. It's just stress, she repeated to herself over and over, trying to regain control. On Thursday, she decided to avoid the cafe and stay in the office all day, steering clear of any accidental encounters. By evening, she started to feel a sense of relief. Everything is fine, she told herself, exhaling her tension. It seemed like things were finally returning to normal. As the workday ended, Charlotte left the office, feeling lighter. She walked slowly towards a parking lot, mentally celebrating that this strange phase was coming to an end. But suddenly, she accidentally bumped into a young man on an electric scooter. The collision caused her papers to scatter across the pavement. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she stammered, quickly kneeling to pick up the documents. The man stopped, smiled, and, without hesitation, helped her gather them. "Thank you," she said, not looking up, feeling embarrassed by her carelessness. He handed her the papers and, looking at her with a sly expression, said, "It's nothing. Sometimes, secrets have a way of coming to light, don't they? I've heard quite a bit about your gratitude." His voice carried a barely concealed smirk. Charlotte's vision darkened with rage. She could no longer hold back. "You little," she shouted, grabbing her folder and throwing it at him. But the man just laughed, effortlessly dodging the attack, and sped off on a scooter, leaving her standing there in fury and despair. Barely managing to keep herself together, Charlotte rushed to her car and drove home. The entire evening, she was on edge, constantly glancing at her phone, as if expecting another surprise. Her mind raced with 100 questions. Unable to bear it any longer, she opened her laptop and began searching for a therapist. She couldn't understand what was happening to her, but one thing was clear: she could no longer handle this alone. On Friday morning, Charlotte arrived at work, feeling the tension gnawing at her from the inside. The night before, she had felt like she was on the verge of a breakdown. Now, the only thing keeping her going was the thought of the weekend. She had even scheduled an appointment with a psychologist to help her cope with the mounting stress, though it wouldn't happen until the following week. Silently praying, she hoped the day would pass without incident. At first, the morning was calm. Work distracted her, pushing her anxious thoughts aside. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe that maybe she had survived the worst, that all of this would gradually fade away. But as lunchtime approached, her sense of peace was shattered. A courier entered the office, carrying an enormous bouquet of crimson roses, their rich fragrance filling the room. Charlotte felt all eyes in the office turn to her as the delivery boy confidently called out, "Delivery for Charlotte." The entire office stared at her, clearly expecting a reaction. Charlotte froze in place as a mix of anger and panic boiled inside her. She rushed toward the courier, trying to suppress her growing irritation. "What makes you think this is for me? I didn't order anything, and I'm not expecting anything." At that moment, several curious colleagues began approaching, forming a small crowd around them. The delivery boy smirked and held up the package. "It's all written right here. To the most magnificent and sexy woman, Charlotte from Logan." For a moment, there was complete silence, followed by muffled laughter and whispers. Colleagues exchanged knowing glances, and Charlotte felt her rage rising. Losing control, she snapped at the courier, unleashing a furious stream of words. Startled, he took a step back toward the exit, trying to avoid further confrontation. The commotion quickly drew the attention of Edward, the company's strict and authoritative director. He entered the office, his sharp gaze locking onto Charlotte as he approached. Picking up the card from the package, he read it, his expression momentarily faltering before he let out a restrained chuckle. All right, he said, scanning the employees gathered around. "Has there been a crisis? Someone's failed attempt at a joke, perhaps." Turning to Charlotte, he attempted to soothe the situation. Charlotte, calm down. You probably need a break, he added, his tone leaving no room for argument. Edward tried to ease the tension with a light-hearted comment, then addressed the crowd. All right, back to work, everyone. No need to turn this into a spectacle. And Charlotte, don't worry, someone just decided to play a prank, nothing serious. To clear any doubts, why don't you and Logan take a lie detector test? The remark amused some employees, who dispersed, laughing quietly. However, Charlotte was trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. Edward wasn't actually considering a lie detector test. He had no real suspicions about her and Logan. But the mere suggestion pushed Charlotte to the edge. Something inside her snapped, and before she could stop herself, she shouted across the office. To hell with all of you. Yes, I sleep with Logan. And it's incredible. Her voice wavered, but her eyes burned with defiance. You're all pathetic, scared little rats, too afraid to live. You're cowards, and I don't care what you think. Her scream echoed through the office. For a brief moment, everything stood still. Employees gawked at her in shock, unsure how to react. Edward paled and carefully sat down, dabbing his forehead with a handkerchief, stunned by her outburst. Ironically, Logan wasn't in the office at that moment. He had left for an important contract signing. If he had been there, Charlotte might have held back. But now, facing a crowd of judgmental colleagues alone, she couldn't take it anymore. Realizing she had nothing left to lose, she grabbed her bag and stormed toward the exit, ignoring the stunned expressions around her. Just then, Logan walked into the office, his face lit up with excitement from a successful deal, only to be met by Charlotte, who grabbed his hand and announced loudly, "Tell them we're lovers. Let them know everything. We're not like them, Logan. We're above this. We're not afraid to show real passion." Logan froze as if struck by lightning. His face immediately contorted in shock and confusion. Pulling his hand away from her grip, he cast a panicked glance at the gathered colleagues, all of whom were watching in stunned silence. "Charlotte, why did you tell them our secret?" he murmured, struggling to process the situation. His words, spoken in the dead silence of the room, only confirmed everything Charlotte had already blurted out. Employees exchanged uneasy glances, murmuring among themselves. Overwhelmed, Charlotte burst into tears and ran out of the office, slamming the door behind her. Logan stood frozen in the middle of the office, utterly bewildered. Running a hand through his hair, he scanned the office, his face filled with despair and fear. Behind him, the hushed whispers of colleagues continued, buzzing like a restless hive. The aftermath of their secret affair could no longer be hidden. Meanwhile, Alexander returned from a business trip, only to be ambushed by Charlotte with a barrage of accusations. She suspected that he had orchestrated everything, but he merely laughed. Enraged, Charlotte grabbed a knife and began threatening him, but Alexander swiftly disarmed her, knocking the weapon from her hand. In a fit of fury, she hurled a chair at the window, shattering the glass in a useless act of destruction. By the time the police and paramedics arrived, Charlotte was exhausted and emotionally drained. Upon seeing strangers in her home, she collapsed onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. She looked utterly broken. Alexander calmly explained to the officers that his wife had been drinking excessively and suffered a severe nervous breakdown. He subtly implied that she might be experiencing alcohol-induced psychosis after prolonged stress and drinking. He conveniently left out the real details of the incident. Charlotte spent nearly a week in the hospital, receiving medical care and therapy. With each passing day, her condition improved, and by the time she was discharged, she was determined to rebuild her life from scratch. However, reality hit her hard. When she returned home, she discovered that Alexander's belongings were gone, along with his presence in what used to be their shared sanctuary. Her heart clenched with suspicion. Grabbing her phone, she immediately dialed Alexander, her voice laced with frustration. "Alexander, what the hell is going on? Why are your things gone? Did you really just leave without saying a word?" His voice was calm, too calm. The chilling politeness in his tone felt like a slap in the face. "Charlotte," he said, pausing to emphasize each word. I simply cannot live with a woman who lost her mind over her own infidelity. His words made her furious, but before she could respond, he continued. Charlotte, let's not make a scene. We'll settle this in court. I've already filed the divorce papers. Oh, and by the way, I've listed our house for sale. I insist that we split the proceeds 80 to 20, 80% for me, 20% for you. That's only fair. Charlotte was livid. She wasn't about to let go of what she had worked so hard for. Listen to me, Alexander. If you think you're going to get 80%, you're dead wrong. At best, we split everything 50 to 50. Or maybe you'll get nothing at all after everything you've done. I have every right to demand a bigger share. Alexander, anticipating her reaction, chuckled with a hint of amusement in his voice. Charlotte, first of all, I did nothing. You're the one who destroyed yourself. Secondly, do you remember when you decided to play dangerous games with a knife? His voice turned ice cold. We have cameras in the house, remember? Or did you conveniently forget? Everything was recorded perfectly. So, I have every reason to demand a divorce on my terms. He let the weight of his words sink in before adding, if you don't accept my terms, I don't know. I might file a police report against you for threatening my life. Take your time to think it over. Charlotte's protests and fury were useless. She realized Alexander had backed her into a corner. She begged him to forgive her, tried to negotiate a fairer split, but Alexander remained firm. In the following months, the divorce proceeded smoothly. Charlotte received her 20%, and Alexander walked away, untouched by the chaos she had created. At work, the scandal left a lasting stain on her reputation, one she could never fully erase. Charlotte and Logan lost their positions. The company, upholding its name, principles, and rules, could not overlook such a scandal and, without hiding its indignation, severed ties with them. Their careers were ruined, and any attempts to restore their reputations were futile. Their past was now forever associated with a humiliating failure. Alexander achieved exactly what he had intended. He had taught Charlotte and her companion Logan the harshest lesson, turning her betrayal into her own downfall. However, deep inside, there was an emptiness that vengeance could not fill. Years passed, but the memories of past happiness did not vanish without a trace. A shadow of regret lingered in his heart. Even though his mind coldly insisted that justice had been served, a part of his soul still yearned for the love they once had.